All right, a couple of things we want to mention that we mentioned Wednesday night just as a reminder, and maybe someone's present who was not here on Wednesday night. Our alternate adult class and this auditorium class have been combined for this trimester. And come January, we're splitting them again. And so whether you refer to that as the young adult or alternative adult, it's for any age adult that wants to go to that class. And just reminding you that's getting started come first Sunday, first Wednesday in January. Ricky Bruce will be teaching Matthew. Dan Duggan will be teaching Genesis. And so if you'd like to go be a part of that class, I think we can accommodate about 15 to 20 in that classroom. If you want to be a part of those are excellent teachers. So just a reminder that that'll be taking place the first part of January. Also, we mentioned then, if some of you have mentioned to me several times you like to put notes, as I do, in the margin of your Bible, and you wished you had a fresh Bible to start with as we go through that, well, you need to be getting you a new Bible if that's what you want. And so we'll be starting through and putting notes in and adding to all of that come January. All right, let's get underway. We're continuing our study of parenting. We're on page 77 of the workbook. And by the way, this is the last week in the workbook. We have 2 more lessons that are added to the workbook. And so you don't need your workbook after today. If you want to leave it at home from here, have at that. We're going to follow the lesson in the workbook, and then we have additional studies that we will add to that. Today we're focusing on letting go. Next time we'll talk about teaching children responsibility. That overlaps to some degree with today's lesson. No apologies there. That needs to be. And then the last one will have to do with communicating with children. And so that's where we will be in the next 2 weeks. Each time we've looked at a rule and try to, at times, relate it to the lesson. Other times it's unrelated to the lesson. Our rules have dealt with even babies all the way to adult children. And so the whole spectrum of parenting. So we add one here that fits with our lesson today. Rule number 20. Train your children so they don't have to depend on you when they are grown. Pretty simple. You agree with that? Why would you agree with that? All right, stand on their own 2 feet. And so if I raise my children so that they have to depend on me for decisions, for finances, for et cetera, we'll talk about all of that as we go on and in our study next time. If I raise them in that fashion, then I haven't done my job in raising my children. So raise your children so that they don't have to depend on you when they're grown. Now, they may turn to you for advice. They may turn to you for some help, for something that's going on. That's fine. That's not what we're talking about. But there are grown children who are dependent on their parents for direction, decisions, finances. Raise your children so that when they're grown, they don't depend on you. Does that make sense? All right. We'll come back to that principle a little bit later. All right. If you're following in the workbook, for the most part, you don't need the workbook. You can follow on the screen. We're going to look at a couple of quotes, and we will read those quotes from the workbook. So we'll turn there. But however you want to use your workbook, that's fine. Page 77 now. We're looking at some introductory points. Our author makes the point here that from birth, the parent gradually shifts responsibility from the parent to the child. You think, I don't want to turn loose and let go of my child, but that time's going to come when they reach about 18, then I'm going to turn loose and let go, or maybe 21. And that's not where it begins. It begins from the time of birth. You begin to let go of the child. And by that we simply mean the parenting job is that of preparing children for independent existence. That's our rule that we just talked about. You want to prepare your child so that they can independently take care of themselves. You still have this family relationship. You still love them. You still care for them. You still do for them. They do for you. All of that. But you're trying to teach them and lead them to independent existence. Parenting is the helping of a child to develop godly traits so that they make good decisions when the parents are not there, either not present or when the parents are gone. They're still making those wise decisions. So you want to raise your child so that when you're dead and gone, they're still making wise decisions rather than depending on you. When you're gone, all good decisions are gone maybe. That's not a good circumstance. So at various points, shifting begins to take place. Again, I think some maybe who don't have children or have never thought about raising children may think, well, if you're raising a child, when you finally get them up so old, as I mentioned a moment ago, 18 or 20, 21, then you're ready to let go. No, that doesn't happen then. There's shifting that takes place at different points. When the child is an infant, they may be totally dependent upon the parents, but then as they get to the toddler age, they start exercising their independence, whether they're ready for it or not. They want to do it their way, as you well recognize if you have children. And then with each year, you begin to give them more freedom and more responsibility. So this child of 5, 6, or 7 years old has far more responsibility and independence than the 2 or 3-year-old, obviously. Well, let's fast forward. They leave for college, then they get married, they're developing more independence. And again, more responsibility. And with each one of those steps, we let go just a little bit here and a little bit there. We'll describe that gradual letting go, that process, a little more later in one of the sections here in just a second. Now, I want to suggest, as our author does here on page 77, that adult children need different parenting than those that are at home. Would you agree with that? If you have children at home, say 5, 6, 7, maybe 10, 12, 15, 16, 18 years old, they need parenting, but adult children that have left home, maybe they're married now or living on their own, they may need some parenting, but different kind of parenting. Would you agree with that? How so? The needs are different. That's a good summary. See, when they leave home, they're no longer under your control. They're no longer under your household. And this is an important point to get. If we don't get any other point, this is a very powerful point for parents whose children are reaching that age of getting married and leaving home. That when they marry, a new family has been formed, and the young man, however inexperienced he may be, however foolish he may be, is the head of that new family. You agree with that? Why do you agree with that? Because that's what God said. It's exactly what God said. Yes, Ephesians 5, 1 Peter 3, just the beginning of those, Genesis 3:16, because God said that. And so we as the parents need to recognize my child is now married, whether my child is male or female, the male in that household is now the head of that household. And so that's not the parents being the head, it's the father or the husband being the head of that new household. Now, I mention that because there may be a point in time, this is not easy, there may be a point in time where that young couple have to remind the parents, we have a new head of this house. We formed a new home, a new house, and the husband is the head of this household. Not you as the parent, not the other parents, but this husband is the head of this new household. Would you agree with that? Why would that need to be established sometimes? Finish my sentence. Because in a new marriage, the parents of the young couple will often forget their place and they'll interfere. You agree with that? Often that happens. So that might have to be reminded that we have a new head of a new household and they're the leader. Again, and I say, no matter how foolish you may be. 1 Peter 3 indicates there was a foolish leader that someone submitted to. I don't know he was foolish in 1 Peter 3. He wasn't a Christian. Exactly. He has not yet obeyed the gospel. Yes, sir.
You know, they need to know that they are continuing love and encouragement is very important.
Absolutely. All right, parents, we need to be careful about advice and comments and any action that interferes or suggests that we want to control. We might not think it comes across that way, but it can come across this suggestion, strong suggestion we're making to this young couple that's got married, or the advice we're handing out may come across as if we're trying to interfere and take control. Be very, very, very careful. Make sense? All right. The letting go process has to occur. Let's go to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. Someone read that for me, please. If you get there, just take off reading Genesis 2:24. All right. Now, this was before any children had been born, because remember, Adam and Eve were full adults when they were created. No children are yet here. Nobody's ever seen children. Nobody's ever reared children. Nobody's gone through that process, and God said this is the way it's going to be, that a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. So that's that letting go process we're talking about, mentioned right here at creation, Genesis 2:24. Does that make sense? And so that's not always easy. That stirs a lot of emotions. When the children leave home, any parent that's been through that as your children got married and they leave home, they went off to college, there's a lot of emotion involved. There's a lot of difficulties on both parts. And yet, that's really what we want, because we wouldn't want it any other way. So do you really want your children to never marry, never leave home, and now they're 50 years old, 60 years old, and they're still living with you, and they've never married, and they're dependent on you for everything? No, you don't want that. You want that letting go. That's a part of the process that you desire. All right. With that in mind, here we're going to look at 5 things today, what letting go means, what it involves. So let's get underway. Letting go means letting children do things for themselves. We're on page 78 if you're following in the workbook, page 78. All right, let's talk about what this means and what this is all about. It means letting them do things for themselves. So children need to be taught various things and then given them space and time to get that done. What does that mean? Give them responsibility. They need to be taught to do various things, and then in the learning process, they need to be given space to do that. Absolutely. Would you agree that this is part of Proverbs 22:6, train a child in the way they should go? I think we typically think that that passage is limited to training them in the word of the Lord, and when they're old, to not depart from it. That may be the primary thought, but it seems to be a general concept, training them in the way they should go. Should you not teach your child how to take care of themselves, so that when they get old, they take care of themselves? Should you not teach them about work and some work ethic, or how to handle money, how you do various things in life, and yet then when they get old, they can take care of themselves, even after you're dead and gone. And so that's part of the training. So we need to be careful about doing things for the child that they are able and capable of doing for themselves. Why is that important? All right, they don't learn, yeah. They don't learn from that. And so don't expect, this is the thing that Kevin just mentioned, don't expect their performance to be at your level. That's a mistake on the part of parents. You do this task, and you're only 3 years old, but I want you to do this task, but you expect them to do it like you could do it, and you are 30 years old. Well, don't expect that of them. They're going to do it like a 3-year-old. And so give them the space to do that. Now, children learn from their mistakes. How do they learn from their mistakes? Say again? Yeah, nothing like experience. Yeah, they're going to learn from those mistakes. And if they have to do a job over, they learn from that, do they not? Our author mentions hauling hay as a young boy on a farm in Texas, where he grew up. And I thought that was a pretty good illustration. He stacked all 400 bales of hay, and then it all fell because he didn't know how to stack it. But he quickly learned. The next year, I bet he stacked it right. And say what? Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And if the child doesn't listen to you, meaning it's more of a rebellious kind of spirit, and there's going to be some consequences, sometimes they need to learn the problems, even a painful experience of the consequences that come with not listening. They may listen the next time. I didn't listen last time. I didn't pay attention, and consequently now I'm in trouble. Make sense? So give them the space to learn. Children need to be given jobs and chores and responsibility. Now this is what our study next week is about, so we're going to quickly go through this, but we get the gist and tie them together a little bit later. Like, for example, and you can add to my list when I get through with the list, cleaning up their toys. And maybe that's at a young age. Maybe cleaning their room, maybe folding clothes, maybe taking out the trash, setting the table maybe, or feeding the animals, the dogs or the cats or the horses or whatever you might have, mowing the lawn or working the garden. And so here's a task that you may give your child just so they can learn responsibility. One of my tasks was working in the garden. And I had to hoe that thing. We had a little walk-behind tractor. I had to plow the thing. I had to hoe that thing. I had to get out there and pick. And it was hard work, at least I thought it was. But yet it taught me something. And many of you have experienced the same kind of thing. Now, this is an important point we can add to the list. Even if the job has to be created. I had a good friend, many of you know, and some of you grew up around Carol Sutton, and grew up in Athens, Alabama. And he told the story about his daddy having a little cotton patch. And he said, we got out there and we had to sow it, we had to work it, we had to hoe it. And he said, we worked ourselves to death in all the boys in the cotton patch. And then Daddy would take the cotton and sell it. And he said, I grew up and I went back and I looked and that cotton patch was awful small. And he said, I said, Daddy, I don't see how you made any money on that cotton patch. And he said, his daddy grinned and said, I wasn't raising cotton, I was raising boys. It's a pretty good point. You may have to create a job. So we don't have much for it. Create a job for your child. It may cost you, but teach them some responsibility. Can you add to my list now of things you may teach your child to do?
Washing the vehicle.
Yeah.
Washing it, cleaning it thoroughly.
Yeah,
It's not make it look better, make it look neat.
yeah,
Go back and redo it.
yeah. That wasn't good enough. Let's do that again. Let's do it right. Be proud of it. All right? Maybe in sports, taking responsibility, keeping up with your stuff, doing the best you can.
It needs to feel needed and wanted and loved, and by them participating in something, they see that they actually have a place in the family and there's things that they can do to help.
That's good. That's a good point. They're contributing to the family, and I'm doing something for the betterment and the good of the family. All right, let's go to page 78. If you're not already there, and we're looking at how letting go is tied to trust. So as you gradually let the child develop their independence and let go, it's tied to trust. Now, when a child takes responsibility and they do quite well with that, the parent then can entrust them with more responsibility and give them greater independence. Make sense? All right. Now, let's add to that a child that performs poorly, though, might have to be overseen and governed just a little bit and advised a little bit until they do the job they ought to be doing. So what did the child just learn from that? They did a job poorly, and the parent had to stand over them and kind of guide them until they got it right. The next time they're given the same job, they do it and do it well, and you give them more responsibility, give them a little more freedom. What did they just learn from that? Yeah, they learned the principle of here's what happens when I don't do well, here's what happens when I do well. They learned that. And they learn the responsibility from that, and they learn something about trust and the fact that you trust them. Now let's go to Matthew chapter 25 and verse 21. Our author calls this a trade-off, and that is as a child takes more responsibility, he gains more independence, more freedom. And this is in the parable of the talents. What's said in Matthew 25 and verse 21? When you get it, read it. Someone.
His master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.
All right, here's the man who had 5 talents. He did well. He gained 5 talents more. Remember that? And here's what was said to him. It was said to him that you've been faithful over this. I'm going to paraphrase. Since you did well in this, I'm going to place responsibility greater than that upon you. I'm going to give you more responsibility. I'm going to bless you further because you did well. Does that make sense? So here's the trade-off, as our author mentions it. A child takes on more responsibility, he gains more independence. I did well here. I get more responsibility. I get a little more freedom. And I'm being trusted. Does that make sense? I'm being trusted. There's a huge message that's being sent to the child that says you are trusted. Now, what value is there in that? Think in the mind of a child. Maybe a child 4 years old, it may be 5, 6, 7, maybe 10. But when the child gets the message, I don't mean that the parent has said, I trust you, but they get the signal through the behavior of the parents. The parents are saying to them, we trust you. You did great on this. We're going to trust you with something else. What does that do to the child? What message is sent to the child? Builds confidence. I'm not looking for anything specific. This is a thought-provoking question. Yeah. Teaches them they can be responsible, absolutely. Now, our author adds this point, that children need to learn this, that this principle is going to affect them. They don't not only need to learn the principle, they need to comprehend this principle affects every relationship in life. Would you agree with that? That's going to affect them, for example, at school. It's going to affect them in sports. It's going to affect them in marriage, their job. And if they don't learn this principle, they're going to get out and get a job, and it's not going to last long because they're not learning to be trusted. Now let's go to Genesis 39 for a moment. What do we learn about Joseph? Thought a well-placed, in the workbook, the well-placed additional note here on Joseph well fits with our point. What do we learn about Joseph in verses 1 to 6? Absolutely. Yeah, he proved himself. The Lord was with him, but the Lord was blessing him because of his own faithfulness and his own trustworthiness, and he showed that trustworthiness to Potiphar. And when Potiphar took notice of that, he gave him more, as Ricky just said, gave him more responsibility and more responsibility and more responsibility until there was no more responsibility to give him except that of Potiphar's own power himself. So notice this. We won't read all of this. Look at verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found favor in his sight. And he served him, and he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put in his hand. In other words, he took everything he said, and I want you to manage this. I trust you with everything that I have. Joseph later said, he trusts me with everything, but he don't want me touching you, when he spoke to Potiphar's wife. And in other words, he spoke, I recognize the trust that and I'm not going to betray that trust. And so that child may be the same way. All right. Same page, page 78. Letting go means releasing control. Letting go means releasing control. You're going to release control of the child over time. And that's part of what we're going to describe. The point here is that the control a parent has over their children is not released all at one time. And I like the illustration given in the workbook. It's like teaching your child to ride a bike. If you've ever had to teach your child to ride a bike, you remember, or maybe your parents taught you how to ride a bike, how that they may walk along beside you and hold the bike and keep it from falling. But then later in the day, or maybe the next day, they let go, but they run along beside of you to keep it from falling. But they're not touching the bike. And then finally they let you go, and they know you're going to crash. They know you're going to have a spill somewhere, and you have to suffer that to learn how to ride a bike. You see the gradual, you don't just let them go all of a sudden, it's gradually you let them go. And the same thing is true with the rearing and the raising of our children. You start letting them go even when they're infants, meaning by that, they're not as dependent on you a year later as they are at first. And so you begin to give them more independence, and you begin to let them go gradually. That's what we're describing here. All right, let's develop another thought here. Some parents err by overprotecting their children and never allowing them to make their mistakes. How so? We're on page 78, bottom of the second column. How is that true? Some parents, they err by overprotecting their children and they don't allow them to make mistakes. Absolutely. Yeah. I like that. Yeah, they got to learn it on their own. Can't totally protect that. Good illustration. How is this true? Everything Ed's talking about. The child has to learn bad decisions have consequences. Bad decisions have consequences. I told you not to do that. You did it, and it's painful. Told you not to touch it. It's hot. Guess what? You got burned. Would you agree with this, that when we shield them from all bad decisions, the child never learns responsibility? And so you know the child, if you don't get on them and you don't sit right there with them and make them get their homework, they're not going to have their homework turn into school the next day. And so you basically do it for them to keep them from getting a bad grade. Have they learned much? No, they hadn't learned much at all. You shield them from bad decisions is the point. So thus when they get to be adults, they may think, you know what, mom and dad's going to bail me out again. They bailed me out all through school. They bailed me out every time I got in trouble. When I was without money, they bailed me out, and they're going to bail me out even again. We'll say more about that here in just a second. Now, some parents never let go of the reins. They only use them differently. We're on page 79 now. I'm not going to go through every one of these. I'm not sure I agree with every point that's made. In fact, this list on page 79, column 1, is not from our author, but is taken from another source. And so some of those we'll just jump on just briefly. His point here is, he talks about adult children. He's not talking about children still in your home, but these are adult children. While you may not be they under your household and under control, some parents try to control the reins anyway. By doing what? Well, he mentions a number of things that we don't have listed on the screen, but he mentions bribery or the appeal to guilt. Because of you, I'm suffering. The way you're behaving, I'm suffering. And so it's a guilt trip. I don't necessarily like what's being said about the power play or the threat. I'll just skip over those. The appeal to authority. I've lived longer than you. I know more than you. The child is married. And so we know more. We understand more, so here's what you need to do. And so we appeal to authority. Or the unfavorable comparison is a big one too, where somebody else, child, is doing better than what you are. I don't understand that. And so what the point is that the parent still tries to hold the reins, and they're trying to manipulate and do that differently. As I make the point here, the parent seeking to control through manipulation somehow. Now, they can't spank the child. They can't put them in time out. They're adult children, but they're trying to control. Now, do you have anything to add to that? Perhaps you can think of some examples. Good point. Good point. He didn't even know what he had. He trusted somebody else to take care of that. Good point. Fully entrusted him. He let go completely. Turned that over. Good point. Perhaps you have, and I hope you were, raised by parents like I had, who turned loose of the reins. And I never felt they were looking over my shoulder. Never felt they were trying to make my decisions. So when I bought something, they were not there to criticize. When I made a decision, they were not there to tell me I was wrong. When I decided to do something, they may not have agreed, but they were right there to be supportive. And I hope you are that kind of parent or were raised with those kinds of parents. Now, some adult children are made to feel that their parents are looking over their shoulders constantly. The point I'm just making. They feel like their parents are constantly looking over their shoulders. And so every decision they make it in view of my parents. They're looking over their shoulder, see their parents watching and critiquing and criticizing. Don't be the parent that looks over the shoulder and critiques and criticizes. Does that make sense? You'll alienate your children by doing so. You'll alienate your children by doing so. All right, let's go further. Say again. Praise them for doing good. Yeah. Now that doesn't mean when children are in sin, you don't try to correct them. That's not what we're talking about. What I'm talking about, let me maybe even back up and comment a little more on that. What I'm talking about in this point right here is when your child decides to buy a car and you criticize them for they didn't need the car right now and they spent too much money. They're adult children, they're married, that's their business. Remember, that household has a new head, and it ain't you. It ain't you. It ain't you. They decide to do something else and they buy something, or they decide to go, well, you don't need to do that. And we advise and we critique and we look over their shoulders. And there may be exceptions to that, but that's the general rule we should follow. Page 79 now. Let's talk about how that letting go versus codependency and enabling, as our author puts it here. So we're on page 79 now, the top of column 2. The children will not always make decisions that please the parents. Well, that's going to be obvious. They didn't always make their decisions when they were in your household. And they're in your household, they don't always make decisions that please you. And they're not going to make those decisions once they're grown that always please you. Sometimes they're going to be sinful. Sometimes it's just judgment you don't like. So let's go back to Proverbs 22:6. We need to understand, we've made this point several times, and I don't apologize for the repetition. I want you to understand that Proverbs 22:6 is a general rule to which there are exceptions. Does that make sense? You said, I trained them right, but they're making unwise decisions. So? You say, well, it's sinful. Okay, I got that. It's sinful. It's bad. But sometimes that happens, doesn't it? Evidence? Ezekiel 18. Ezekiel 18 talks about how a righteous man could have a wicked son and a wicked man could have a righteous son. If we're familiar at all, even have a smattering knowledge of Ezekiel 18, we know that principle is true. So you could be a righteous person and raise a child that becomes wicked and makes wicked decisions. So the child will make decisions that you don't always agree with. Now, this is a point I hadn't fully developed in my mind as our author did, and I think this is quite fascinating. And that is, let's talk about Eli. Eli was condemned for not restraining his children. So let's go over to 1 Samuel and develop a thought here. Now, we often take this passage and quote it frequently, that Eli's sons were evil because he did not restrain them, and we apply it more in the idea that when his children were small, and it very possible he didn't, that he didn't discipline and train his children, so now they turned out to be evil. I think that we can take the same principle and apply it there, but I don't think that's what that's saying. So 1 Samuel chapter 3, let's go there first, 3 and in verse 13, we've dealt with this before, how that the sons of Eli were vile and he did not restrain them. Now keep that in your mind. Let's go back to chapter 2 now, and in verse 12 to 17, the verse 12 says they were corrupt and they didn't know the Lord. And the priest's custom was that people came and talks about what they did in bringing the sacrifice. And so, in other words, they abused the people. They were priests, and they abused the people, took advantage of them, and they were doing wrong and doing evil. So, here's the point we don't often tie with that. They were doing this while they were priests, according to 1 Samuel chapter 2, but Numbers 4, verse 3 and verse 23, shows they had to be at least 30 years old to be priest. And so they're not under his care anymore. They're not small children. We're not talking about a 5-year-old child that he's not restraining or a teenager. We're talking about 30-year-old priests that are not being restrained, at least 30 years old. So here's the point. He didn't deal with their sin as he should. That's what he's saying. They were vile, and he didn't restrain them. In other words, they should have been removed. Their sin should have been dealt with. They should have been removed from the priesthood, but he didn't deal with that like he should. And sometimes we're that way, where there may be a grown child that's in sin, and we don't deal with the sin like we should. We're not rebuking them. We're not restraining them in that sense. Make sense? So can we take that principle and apply it to raising that 5-year-old child? You're not disciplined, and so the child may turn out, yeah. Sure, you can take that. But let's put that back in its context, and I think that makes more sense. So one of the problems of letting go is that we can't control our children's choices. So your children get grown, they get married, and you can't control their choices. Now stop and think about that. Let's footnote right here. Let's freeze the movie right here, the video, and let's just make a footnote. Do you really want to control their choices? Do you want to be responsible for their choices, or you want them to be responsible? I think I want them to be responsible. I've got enough problems being responsible for my choices. So now let's unfreeze that. Let's go back. You don't really want to be responsible. So part of the problem of letting go is we can't control their choices. And it's hard. And our author makes the point, you don't have to agree with their choices. They may be sinful choices. But if you don't listen to this next point carefully, you're going to misunderstand it. Here's the point. you have no choice but to accept it as reality. Not accept it in the sense that your child may even become a homosexual and you say, I can't accept that. Well, I understand you can't accept it in the sense you embrace it and you approve of it, but you have to have no choice but to accept it as reality. It's a fact. Your child quit going to church. They've left the Lord. You say, I can't accept it. You ain't got no choice. You ain't got no choice. It's a reality. It's a fact. And we have to come to grips with it. Does that make sense? That's part of the difficulty of letting go. I wished I could change that. No, you can't change that. You have to accept it as reality. Now, those statements are completely removed from all the emotion that's involved. So in the process, some parents try to cover for their children and bail them out. How so?
Accept that reality and they try to cover up mistakes and lies.
Absolutely. On page 80, I want to hit this quickly. Our time is quickly getting by, and so I want to hit a couple of points before we leave this study. I've seen this happen time and again. In fact, I'll tell you about a case I know and disguise it a little bit, lest somebody know who I'm talking about. I don't think you would. I don't think if I mentioned the name, you'd even know the name. But anyway, talks about how the parents, when the child has stolen, or they cover their bad checks or pay off their loan. In other words, they're enabling them. Once knew of a dad who was in business with his son, and the son was very poor running the business, but when others who were in business with them would raise questions, the dad always covered for him. Here's his excuse. Here's the problem. He's covering for him all the time. Well, then the son stole from the business. When others in business with him ask, the dad pays it back and tries to cover it up. And just on and on and on. And so the son goes to jail, and then the dad puts him in business. As soon as he can get him out of jail, puts funds to pay a business for him, etc. My point is covering, and enabling. And therein is part of the problem. All right. Now, I want to skip that and make this one last point. Letting go means there's going to be an empty nest. And so the point here our author makes is you got to realize, and I'm just going to quickly mention this, you got to realize that however many years your child is with you, you're going to have years beyond that once they've left, that the husband and wife are going to be still living together if all things are equal. And don't neglect of preparing for those years of the empty nest. You may, as our author mentioned this point you are right here. He mentioned this, that you may find yourself living with a total stranger. And so the point is, don't neglect your marriage during those years of raising your children. Make sense? Now, what else do we want to mention? I think that's about. This is important. We'll stop right here. That we need to clarify, and this is on page 80. Our author makes this. This is quite a quick summary of what our author is saying on page 80. Letting go doesn't mean you don't care anymore for your children. That doesn't mean you're not supportive and you're not concerned. It does mean you don't judge their every action. It does mean you don't enable them, and it does mean you're not making decisions for them. You're letting them go. Make sense? We'll stop right there.